bioethics, actually the word bioethics is relatively new. It didn't come around till about the early 60s as actually a term, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But when we're talking about ethics, we really talk about the decision maker. How do we make decisions? And I think it's useful to go over the varieties of ethical principles that society uses and historically were present. And when we think about decisions, I like to reference in 1 Kings where at Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." And Solomon answered, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and distinguish right from wrong." So distinguishing right from wrong is a decision, and it's a decision maker, as Solomon was a judge, and that's considered wisdom. And it was a great gift that God gave to Solomon, who was considered the wisest man because of that gift. And so when we look at people who make decisions, it's hard. And that's why we have to look at different policies, different ways of looking at it, and particularly as Christians to look at Scripture. And Scripture tells us the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. And it is not good to have zeal without knowledge. So it's really appropriate for us to educate ourselves, both within Christian bioethics and in the secular forms of reasoning, so we can understand how people make decisions and what's the best way for us to make decisions. And there are a number of online resources. Christian Medical and Dental Association has a website that has lots of good policies. That's one of the things we do on the ethics committee, is we write statements and policies for many different ethical issues. And so we try and keep up with the current literature as well as just the current topics, and that's a good source. The Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity is a center that's associated with Trinity International University in Deerfield, the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network, Center for Bioethics at Cedarville, and there's others, but these are some of the websites in which you can look for information. They often refer to articles as well as books, and some of them, particularly the Center for Bioethics and Culture, have video clips and even films that you can use in learning about bioethical issues and also in teaching. So what is bioethics? Bioethics examines ethical issues related to the provision of health care, medical technology, medical research, and looks at it both from individual and social perspectives. In the past, medical ethics was pretty much physician-oriented. It was how the physician should behave, how the physician would make decisions. Bioethics is a more global approach to these complex issues. So it's provision of health care by physicians, but also by nurses, other healthcare professionals, by hospitals and healthcare systems. And it particularly looks at medical technology. There are things today that when I was in medical school would have easily been considered science fiction. And these technologies today is amazing. Medical research, and I'll show you that medical research, particularly wrongly instituted, really drives home the need for ethics. And it includes both individual and social perspectives, not only the treatment team, but the patient's family, society, culture, the allocation of resources. It's a more global approach to medical ethics. So the important themes in bioethics is, what does it mean to be human? You would think that would be simple, but it's an important concept. And probably more important is, when is someone that's a human being a person? When does personhood begin? Because it appears that science with genetics is hard-pressed to deny that someone is a member of the species Homo sapien as soon as fertilization occurs, because the genetic makeup is individual and doesn't change. So the argument often proceeds to, when does that individual become a person? The value of human life, which is related again to personhood, and also whether or not that person can contribute to society, is sometimes used as important, and bioethics helps address some of that. The tension between playing God and responsible stewardship. Playing God used to be this kind of a catch-all term, but now with some of the technology that's available, particularly in genetic engineering, in splicing DNA and altering genes in embryos, as well as being able to combine human and animal genes, that actually becomes very important. And of course, the tension between individual liberty and communal responsibility. When does your autonomy override the good and needs of others? As well as the allocation of healthcare resources, which may become more and more an issue in bioethics as time goes on. Now, bioethics and Christian ministry interfaces in three major ways: in apologetics, pastoral, and professional. In apologetics, there's identification of helpful and unhelpful ways in which the church at all levels may engage with the community and media on bioethical issues. And so it's one of the facets that's taught where I got my MA in bioethics at Trinity in the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, is to try and give people ways of talking to the media, ways of giving interviews, writing articles, writing editorials for newspapers or on blogs, so that there can be a discussion about this. Pastoral, identification of strategies for churches at different levels of organization to engage in creative and pastorally sensitive ministry for those who have bioethical issues. And that pretty much almost defines this course. I mean, being able to have disability ministries in a church as an outreach, as well as ministering, giving it information that others may not actually be aware of, to be able to know how to care for those who are disabled, how to have a welcoming church, how to have a welcoming environment is very important. And of course, professional, and that's what the Christian Medical and Dental Association often concentrates on, is identification of strategies for Christian healthcare professionals to maintain and commend Christian values in their practice, as well as a witness to patient and colleagues. And so whether it's nurses, physical therapists, pharmacists, and many other healthcare workers, being able to discuss and use bioethics in your Christian ministry is very much a part of this direction. Now, if we look at bioethics in the church, bioethics also provides special opportunities for the gospel. When people encounter infertility, illness, and the fragility of their own bodies, and when they confront their own mortality as they observe or experience the dying process, the illusion of control over their lives is threatened or even shattered. It's a major trauma and a major transition to have something very suddenly and unexpectedly occur, whether it's a premature child, whether it's a stillborn, whether it's somebody that has a stroke, somebody gets a diagnosis of cancer, difficulty getting pregnant. It's it really stretches, and it's just like what Dr. Waters said in Job, it's part of whether it's suffering, and suffering may be the loss of someone or maybe the struggle with having children, is that really your concept of God is very important at that point. So where will such people turn for help when their questions and the decisions they must make about medical treatments? Unfortunately, the medical profession isn't as trusted as it used to be in the past, particularly since they somewhat veered from the Hippocratic Oath, which we'll talk about. And so being a resource, whether it's a Christian ministry, whether it's formal pastoral ministry, is important to be knowledgeable about this, to be able to help people. When somebody's trying to make a difficult decision and they want advice from someone that has a Christian worldview, it's important to be educated on that. If Christians become known as reliable and thoughtful sources of information and counsel about these issues, opportunities to present a Christian view of life, meaning, suffering, and death will arise. And so the questions at the heart of bioethics are also at the heart of the gospel. And if we look at this statement, this was written by H.E. Sechrist, who was a very eminent Jewish medical historian. And he wrote in one of a large treatise on the history of medicine, the most important and decisive development in a special status assigned to the sick was introduced by Christianity. This new teaching, in contrast to other religions for the healthy and just man, appealed to the sick, to the weak, and to the crippled. It spoke of spiritual healing, but it also spoke of bodily healing. And those were many of the lectures we heard earlier about this exact subject. But it was even recognized by an historian just from a pure secular process looking back, and by someone who was not a Christian, to really see how important that really was. So if we look at medical ethics traditionally, a lot of it relates to, let's see, we got back too fast here, the Hippocratic Oath. And what's often referred to as the Hippocratic tradition of Western medicine, because there's a statement by Hippocrates, as to diseases make a habit of two things, to help or at least to do no harm. Actually, that's technically not in the Hippocratic Oath, it's in his book called Epidemics, but it used today as the principle of beneficence, which means to help, and non-maleficence, to do no harm, often referred to as the Latin phrase prima non nocere, or first do no harm. Now, the Hippocratic Oath probably wasn't written by Hippocrates. It was probably written by a philosophical school called the Pythagoreans. And some of you may remember from high school algebra, the Pythagorean theory. I won't ask you to give that, because I don't think I can either right now. But they stood alone during a time where it was very common to have abortion, infanticide, suicide. They stood alone against suicide and abortion. They thought, and they were very unique, and this was long before Christ, that the embryo was an animate being from conception. They didn't understand conception as fertilization as we know it now, but they're meaning from the moment that a human being started to form, that it was animate. And the Hippocratic Oath was adopted by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and became the basis of Western medicine for well over 2,000 years. If we read the Hippocratic Oath, which I advise you to do, just search it online and just read it, it comes up with the principles that it's amazing what it covers, as long as this was written over 2,500 years ago. Of course, we talked about beneficence, or benefiting the sick, non-maleficence, avoid harm, abstain from sexual relations with patients, is in the Hippocratic Oath, do not discriminate, slaves or free, men or women, It prohibits physician-assisted suicide. It prohibits abortion. And it mentions that a physician should refer to experts when indicated. The Hippocratic Oath, when it was written, the term physician replied to what we think of today as internal medicine practitioners, not surgeons. So they would refer, if someone needed to have an operation, to the cutter of the stone, they call it, because that was the surgeon. And it also talks about patient confidentiality. Whatever you hear when you go into the house should remain confidential. So these are principles that really have stood the test of time until not too long ago when we started to have a crack in the dam with abortion and assisted suicide. So when we look at medical ethics, can we do something is a medical question, somewhat of a technological, scientific question. Can we actually do this particular procedure? May we do it is a legal question. Is it legal by the laws? Do you have privileges at the particular hospital and so forth? But should we do something is the ethics question, sorry. Now, this is going to be one of the problems with not having the, this was supposed to animate in, but I'll try and read through the double. Theology, medicine, and law were the three major disciplines in universities for a long time. And in fact, most people, when universities first started in Europe, trained in usually two, mostly theology and medicine, or theology and law. And what we see today is that theology has been replaced with philosophy, medicine's been replaced with science, and law has been replaced with politics. And so ethics is what keeps medicine from becoming a science. And so there's more and more pressure in medicine for it to become really a pure science. And as science allows this, we can do something. If we get the laws to allow us, then the question is, should we do something? Without the ethics part of that, then it just becomes a pure science. We can do this, and so we'll just go ahead and do it. So the ethics is the study of what is moral. There's ethical theory, and we'll talk a little bit about some of them. And then there's the ethical decision-making, which is applied ethics. So because you'll hear, particularly in university settings, those of you who are in universities, or maybe your children will or eventually will be attending, they'll take philosophy and other courses, and different concepts of ethics will arise. And so it's good to just give a brief overview of some of the basic principles about ethics. And so ethics is about drawing boundaries. What's inside the box is ethically permissible, and what's outside the box is impermissible. So that begs the question, who gets to draw the box? And then it also is important, and we'll see at the next session, about who gets to make the border calls at the beginning of life and the end of life. And so that's part of the ethical decision-making, and part of when it's really a close call. And sometimes I think being in medical ethics, it's like a little league umpire. No matter how hard you try and make the right call, somebody's parent is chasing you to the car with a baseball bat at the end of every game. Or this child saying, what criteria do you use to determine who is naughty or who is nice? While he's interviewing Santa Claus on the stand. So ethical theories fall into two broad categories. Normative ethics classifies actions as right or wrong. It's what the population should believe is right or wrong. And then, of course, those who are proponents of that believe that there is a right and a wrong. where descriptive ethics is what the population actually believes to be right or wrong, and different cultures have different beliefs of what is right and what is wrong. So let's start with an ethical assessment. John lied and Mary was fired. If the most important aspect of that issue is the person, the actor, the decision maker, or is it the act itself, lying, or is it what happened, Mary was fired? But what happened if John lied and Mary's life was spared? So which of those three might be the most important, or the way you should look at a decision-making criteria? So if we look at the person's character and motive, if that's the primary part of that to rely on, it falls into the broad category of virtue ethics. If it's the act itself is right or wrong, it falls into what's called deontological ethics, deon meaning duty. And if you look at the consequences of the act, is it good or bad, that's utilitarianism. The end justifies the means. So if we look at virtue ethics emphasizes the character of the moral agent instead of the rules or consequences of the act. And it's in this arena, virtues are learned and reinforced by habits to develop good character. And of course, you need mentors to be able to give examples to train people to be virtuous and of good character. Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas were kind of classic virtue ethicists. And in the Roman Catholic Church, they often use the teachings of Aquinas, who uses Aristotle, and it's called the Aristotelian or Thomistic approach to ethics, sometimes just referred to the Thomistic approach. And in fact, I get a number of journals on medical ethics, and it's probably not a month goes by where one of them doesn't have an article that talks about the Thomistic view of such and such. So it's still a very active form of ethics. And if we look at the concept of chivalry, say the Knights of the Round Table, the English gentlemen, Boy Scouts, these are character trainings. It's modeling and teaching good character. And it was the dominant system, not just in medicine, but it was the dominant system in society for how people should behave until the time of the Enlightenment. And then when we get to the Enlightenment, it's around the 18th century, some of the principles of the Enlightenment are that the universe is fundamentally rational and can be understood through the use of reason alone. Truth can be arrived at through observation and the use of reason or science, and religious doctrines have no place in the understanding of the physical and human worlds. And so that's where, when I was talking about science, we want to keep medicine from becoming a science. It's this type of principle. So utilitarianism is another one of those normative ethical theories, and that's where the morality of an act is determined by the end result, or consequentialism, the end justifies the means. If we look historically, and those of you who have taken philosophy will see that Jeremy Bentham was one of the proponents of utilitarianism. He was an English social reformer, and he had a lot of good intentions and good ideas. He was big on prison reform. He was just socially very active, and his form of utilitarianism is that the world is governed by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. And so he actually he could even rate the pain or pleasure by a little criteria called hedons, Hedon. And so he was a hedonistic utilitarianism in which he could decide how much pain, how much pleasure, and you want to use whatever gives the most people the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. John Stuart Mill was another utilitarian in that similar time frame, and he's called a eudynamistic utilitarian. That's a Greek for happiness. And not happiness just in gleefulness, but happiness in contentment. So he took pain and pleasure and moved it up more to more issues related to contentment. And today, probably the best known utilitarian is Peter Singer. And he is a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. He's a very big proponent of animal rights. In fact, he talks about speciesism, which is prejudice towards animals, that they should have the same rights as human beings since there's no difference. And he's a proponent of infanticide, abortion, doesn't have much use for the disabled population. And there was an article he wrote a number of years ago in the Dallas Morning News that were quoted people saying, what's going to happen in the next 35 years? Where is society going to be? And so this was in 2005, and he said, during the next 35 years, the traditional view of the sanctity of human life will collapse under pressure from scientific, technological, and demographic developments. By 2014, it may be only a rump, hardcore, know-nothing religious fundamentalist will defend the view that every human life from conception to death is sacrosanct. So he's very outspoken about that. But he says that we should be able to, if abortion is he'll admit abortion is killing a child. And so what's the difference between infanticide and abortion? You might as well, if you're not sure you're going to want the child, just wait till it's born, and then you should be able to euthanize the child. Now, the third of the views, virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and then we have the deontological ethics, which is a rule-based, and the best-known philosopher for that is Immanuel Kant. He developed a principle-based or deontological ethics based on reason alone called Kantian ethics, and the majority of Christian philosophers probably would be categorized in this area of Kantian ethics, although just as opposed to the others. Moral duties do not vary with circumstances, and there is what he called categorical imperatives. And one of them is to act in such a way that your action should become a universal law, which means if you say lying is wrong, lying is always wrong, it should be a universal law. So, and his second, which is to act or to treat humans in every case as an end, never as merely a means to an end. And so each human person has human dignity and should be treated as such. He's considered a champion of inherent human dignity, and he is quoted in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki. So the idea that every human being has intrinsic worth and human dignity is also related to this philosopher from the Enlightenment. Now, if we go to the descriptive ethical theories, we have cultural relativism. That is, different cultures have differing standards of right and wrong. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Ethical subjectivism, what's right for me is right, and what's right for you is right, postmodernism. And then we have probably the most popular form today is conventionalism. Cultural acceptance determines morality. We used to think homosexuality was wrong, now we don't. We used to think abortion was wrong, now we don't. We used to think assisted suicide. And so it's that cultural acceptance is like, and then it becomes law, and you can see how that Venn diagram kind of ties together. One of the problems, not one of, but one of the many problems with the descriptive theories, particularly in conventionalism, is what happens when we have countries that use eugenics as far as their treatment of human beings. Positive eugenics started out as to promote reproduction of those who have desirable or superior traits, and negative eugenics is to prevent reproduction of those who have undesirable and inferior traits. So you would encourage breeding, and this came from, by the way, animal husbandry of breeding stock, so they started to apply it to humans, and then it went from to sterilization of those who they considered unfit, and then to euthanasia. Now, we often think that this was a policy that started in Nazi Germany. Well, not so much. Actually, most of it started in the United States. There was a classic, well-known lawsuit that was brought in by Carrie Buck, or her representatives, who at the time, when she was 18, she was an involuntary resident of Virginia State Colony of Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. She's the daughter of a feeble-minded mother in the same institution and the mother of an illegitimate feeble-minded child. And she was the first person selected for forced sterilization in Virginia, and the law was challenged at that time by conservative Christians. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the U.S. upheld Virginia's forced sterilization law. And I can read from part of the decision by the Chief Justice. It's better for all the world, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in his decision in 1927. So this movement about better breeding and getting rid of the unfit was then, the Nazis became quite interested in that. So they eventually then started similar movements in Germany, which then ultimately led from sterilization to euthanasia, and then eventually moved on to human experimentation, where they would use humans for scientific experiments without their consent, and many of them caused death or severe harm. The Nuremberg trials then gave rise eventually to what was called the Nuremberg Code, and that's the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. That was a worldwide code. And then in the United States, the Belmont Report was working on medical experimentation and came up with 3 basic ethical principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And so probably the beginning of the consciousness of society of the area of bioethics started in some sense around the Nuremberg trials, and when the atrocities became manifest of what actually was going on in these camps. Eventually, that led to trying to take the principles of medical experimentation and apply those to the regular practice of medicine. And so the holy grail, so to speak, for secular bioethicists is to find a value-neutral approach. In other words, kind of like the Enlightenment, is that we had one that uses principles but applies to everybody and is not based on religion or even a view of God. So several in Georgetown, Beecham and Childress wrote a well-known book called Principles of Biomedical Ethics, which is actually in its 7th edition today. It's probably one of the more common textbooks on biomedical ethics. And they use what's called the principle-based bioethics, and they came up with 4 Autonomy, self-determination, beneficence, to do good, non-maleficence, to do harm. We saw that goes back to the Hippocratic Oath. And then justice, which is loyalty and fairness. Now, what happened is that autonomy was kind of the newcomer in the principles. We've always had, in a sense, beneficence, non-maleficence, and then justice. There was always at least some form of justice. But the evolution of autonomy began in the 80s and has moved through, started off as respect for persons that we saw in the Belmont Report, then respect for autonomy, then it became a principle, as we saw, one of four, then it became the dominant principle, then it became a right. First, the right to refuse treatment. It was amazing that when refusing treatment, the people who were the most opposed to it at the time were the physicians in the hospitals. And so the families had to go to court to ask for withdrawal of life support. And now it's the right to demand treatment, which sometimes, and we'll talk about the issue of futility. So if we look at decision-making, and this is kind of a chart, if we look on the, I guess I got to move the next slide there. On the far right, it's physician-driven. This would be what's called paternalism, where the physician makes the decision, and that's the end of the discussion. On the far left is the patient or whoever's responsible for the patient makes a complete decision. They may be given a menu of options, but this is what we want. In general, most people try, it's like most things, to go for the middle of the road and have equal partners, where physician and the patient or the patient's representative try and work out and negotiate treatment. A little more paternalistic is informed non-dissent. That's a term you might hear occasionally. That's a term that pediatric ethicists have started to use, and it's because it's so difficult sometimes for parents to make hard decisions that the team will say, here's what we plan on doing, and they don't necessarily ask for, they have to have the discussion, but it's not like somebody signing a death warrant, so that's the term they use. And then the physician recommendation. So it's a sliding scale. And the problem with autonomy is it goes both ways, is that there's physician autonomy too, where you can't ask a physician to do something they feel is in good conscience not what they should do. And we see that with assisted suicide in some states, asking for that, or abortion. If you should if you're the only OB in the county, you should provide that. So you get issues of autonomy both within the patients and within the physicians. And so sometimes, and we'll see this in the next session when we talk about some of the Christian Medical and Dental Association's guidelines and policies, there's a little bit of a spectrum. I tell those that take my course at Dallas Seminary, I wish I could give them a laminated 3x5 card at the end of the course and have every decision, but just like we saw with Solomon, it's hard, and sometimes you have to have a gray area where this is absolutely forbidden, this is discouraged, this is permissible, and so forth. And so sometimes the guidelines fall in that direction. And then if we look at then, what are the distinctives of Christian bioethics? We talked about the major secular views, although virtue ethics and deontological ethics are also used by Christians. But the distinctives are, it's Hippocratic in orientation, and basically those principles that we saw: no abortions, no assisted suicide, patient confidentiality. That it's Hippocratic in origin, and medicine is a covenant relationship. That means the physician and the patient have a relationship that's not just a contract. You're not a transaction. It's not like you're hiring somebody to redo your kitchen and you say, here's the cabinets that I want and here's the paint that I want and so forth, and then I'll have a contract. And medicine, and that's medicine being a pure science or a pure transactional relationship. So maintaining that covenant relationship is, I'm going to try and do the best for you. I'm going to be your physician, and is very important. Human dignity from conception to natural death. All truth is God's truth, and science is a sacred trust. So there's nothing wrong with science. There's nothing wrong, like I mentioned, that there's wonderful things that would have been considered science fiction years ago that are happening, and it's amazing. But technology must be directed in morally responsible paths. And so we need to have, we can't just allow carte blanche, pure science. Now that we can do it, then it's available. The other thing that's important when talking about interacting, particularly with both Christians and non-Christians, is that it's important not only to be knowledgeable of these areas in bioethics, but also to be compassionate and loving. Like in Colossians says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have with one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. So I think being able to be a light in the world in some of these is very important. I think being respectable and professional in the way we interact with others that might disagree with us is important. And I think showing that they'll know we're Christians by our love is important.